What would you do if a key turned, a door creaked open, and you walked into the home you'd just inherited, only to sense immediately that something inside was deeply, irrevocably wrong? A house where the air pressed heavy on your skin, as if the very walls had been holding their breath for nearly a century, and you'd just let it out. The story you're about to hear is not for the faint-hearted. It is about a family name once spoken with respect in a small Connecticut town, and the revelation that shattered that illusion forever. For 93 years, the Durnham mansion stood as a symbol of wealth, influence, and tradition. When the truth finally emerged, it became instead a monument to a secret so appalling it defied belief. Meet Sarah Collins, 28, a freelance journalist in Boston who'd made a modest career unraveling cold cases and strange historical mysteries. She'd expected her latest assignment to be another article pitched to a niche magazine. Instead, on an overcast October afternoon in 2019, she found herself parked in front of a sprawling Victorian estate in Millbrook, Connecticut, holding the inheritance papers that would change every certainty in her life. The house had belonged to her great-aunt Margaret Durnham, a woman Sarah remembered meeting only twice. The first, at Sarah's college graduation, when Margaret's sharp blue eyes seemed to look straight through her. The second, at Margaret's funeral, 2 weeks before the mansion became hers. From the moment Sarah stepped out of her car, she noticed the stillness. Not the quiet comfort of an old home, but a watchful silence, like something inside was waiting to see what she would do. Its windows were dark, reflective, unreadable. The gardens had gone chaotic, and weeds curled between the stones of the carriage drive. Inside, dust sheets draped over furniture hinted at rooms once filled with laughter. Gilded frames still held oil portraits, but in the dim light their painted eyes seemed uncanny in their attention. The scent in the air was a mingling of age and something sharper, stranger. Sarah's fingers tightened on her bag. She had planned to visit, take photographs, and leave. But years of investigative instinct pressed her forward, instead of out the door. It was a choice that would lead her into hidden spaces, family lies spanning generations, and the most macabre secret Millbrook had ever buried. The front door swung shut behind Sarah Collins with a muffled thud, the weight of it reverberating up into her bones. For a moment, she just stood there in the grand foyer, listening to the settling groans of a house that felt far from empty. The light through the stained glass over the door smeared the air in muted colors. Her own breath trailed visible in front of her. The heating had long since stopped, and the air inside was colder than the overcast day outside. Somewhere deep within the building, she thought she heard the faintest vibration, a hum too low to name. It had been years since anyone lived here properly. Margaret Durnham had kept only a part-time caretaker in her final years, and even he had resigned months before her death. From the foyer, Sarah could see 3 doorways leading into shadowed rooms, each blocked in part by heavy curtains that dulled the sparse daylight. She started with the parlor on the left. Dust swirled in the beam of her flashlight, settling on floor-to-ceiling shelves crowded with leather-bound books whose gold-embossed titles had faded to near illegibility. A grand piano sagged under the weight of its dust cover, its keys hidden as if the silence here might be broken if anyone dared touch them. A wide-framed doorway led into the dining room. The long table was set with mismatched silverware beneath, layers of dust, like the remains of some final dinner no one had returned to clear. The chairs, 12 of them, stood tall and solemn, pushed neatly back as though in expectation of guests. It was in the study across the hall, however, that tension began to coil in Sarah's stomach. The room smelled faintly of stale cigars, though the ashtray on the desk held nothing but dust. Drawers on one side of the massive oak desk were locked, but the top right had been wrenched open, splintering its joinery. Inside lay an assortment of scattered papers, letters penned in a tight looping hand and signed only with initials. She pulled out her phone and began photographing. At first glance, they read like ordinary correspondence, But the phrases, the keeper arrangements confirmed, and the next harvest froze her fingers. One letter, dated 25 years earlier, mentioned Thomas arriving on schedule. The name seemed innocuous on its own, but coupled with ancient protocols and preparation, it turned into something else entirely, and Sarah's reporting instincts told her she had just stumbled onto a breadcrumb that would not be easily shaken. She moved upstairs. Sarah reached the second-floor landing and found herself staring down a gallery-like hallway. The walls were lined with portraits, family groupings, rendered in oil across 5 generations. At a glance, they were what you'd expect from New England aristocracy: stern patriarchs, high-collared matriarchs, children in formal dress. Then she noticed the alterations. In each grouping, one gap stood out, where a child's figure had clearly been cut away from the canvas with precision. Always one, always of roughly the same age. Early teens. Her flashlight beam passed over faces that, though painted in different centuries, each carried something she couldn't unsee. An expression that mixed grief with grim acceptance, and in some, a suggestion, no more than the faintest curve to the lips or glint in the eyes of satisfaction. Sarah's pulse quickened. She knelt to photograph each portrait, making note of dates and names on their plaques. The same gaps, repeated, stretching back to one Jeremiah Durnham, the family patriarch who had built this place in the 1880s, and his wife Constance. For children in their portrait remained, yet the faint ghost outline of a fifth lingered within the gilded frame. The third floor was dimmer still. The singular intact bedroom she found there bore wallpaper of cheerful sailboats peeling along the seams. At first it seemed preserved for nostalgia. Then she noticed it. One section of wall near the window was subtly brighter, the paper newer. She pressed her palm flat, hollow. With a kitchen knife from downstairs, she scored along its edge. The flap of wallpaper peeled back to reveal wood panels. One slid aside with surprising ease. Inside was a narrow recess no more than 3 feet across, and tucked into that cube of stale air lay a folded set of children's clothes, a stack of notebooks, and a small bundle of photographs. The clothes matched styles from decades past, neatly washed, pressed, and tagged Thomas. The notebooks all bore the same name and contained entries in distinctly different handwriting styles. Sarah sat cross-legged on the dust-cloaked floorboards, lit only by flashlight and the dim gray of the sky beyond the window. Flipping open the oldest diary, dated 1926, she read the opening line: "Today is my 12th birthday. The Durnhams say I'm family now." The hair on her arms lifted. A century might have passed, but whoever Thomas was, he, or they, were still here in these walls. Sarah's fingertips lingered on the first diary. The paper was brittle, its edges browned, but the ink had faded. Surprisingly little dark words pressed by the heavy hand of a boy, just beginning to discover the weight of secrecy. March 15th, 1926. My 12th birthday. They say I belong to them now. I'm not to tell anyone about where I came from. As she read, the picture formed slowly. A child brought into the house, dressed in fine clothes, educated privately, yet kept apart. Some diary pages painted idyllic scenes of elaborate meals and fireside reading, but between them, disturbingly, were rules. Do not enter the basement. Swallow the bitter tonic every morning. Avoid speaking to the others. One name kept repeating in different contexts. Margaret, younger than the current Margaret she'd known, but clearly the same person. A child warning Thomas in oblique terms not to be too comfortable here. Cryptic words that stilled Sarah's breath. The diary ended nearly a year later, March 14th, 1927. Tomorrow is my 13th birthday. Mr. Durnham says it is time for me to join the family forever. I don't know what that means, but I am afraid. Sarah closed it with a snap that echoed faintly in the empty room. There were others: 1941, 1967, 1984, 2003, each starting with the 12th birthday and ending on the eve of a 13th, each. Signed Thomas, yet obviously written by different boys. The pattern crystallized in her mind. A boy named Thomas, every generation, vanishing after one precisely measured year. She photographed each diary meticulously, wary of disturbing the arrangement in the recess. A journalist's instinct told her she was holding the thread of something vast, and that she was very much alone in a house that hadn't wanted to give it up. Back downstairs, she began exploring other rooms with new eyes. Behind closet walls and fake backs to wardrobes, she found smaller caches, folded clothes from eras long gone, child-sized shoes, sepia photographs of boys with stiff collars and unsmiling expressions. In each case, the label was the same, Thomas. By late afternoon, her nerves were taut. She decided to step out for air and perhaps to test the waters in town about the Durnham name. The October sky outside was already leaching toward dusk, shadowing the tangle of branches over Elm Street. The first few interactions told her much. At the small general store, the conversation chilled the moment she mentioned the old mansion's inheritance. Clerks exchanged glances. One abruptly walked away. Passing townsfolk met her eyes briefly before veering to the other side of the street. It wasn't until she reached the sagging benches by the town square that someone spoke at length. An elderly man scattering seed for pigeons glanced at her, and then away. "You're Margaret's kin," he said softly, as if repeating it might cause some harm. His name was Harold Petton, and as he spoke, his voice carried a weight that nearly buckled her. "The Durnhams never took a boy without getting something in return," Harold said, eyes fixed on the birds. "Back when times were mean, if a family owed them money, they'd clear the debt. Only catch was, the youngest boy had to go stay with them for a year. Came back?" He shook his head slowly. "They never did. If a family refused," Harold told her, misfortune followed fast: a fire to the barn, a sudden loss of work, an accident no one would investigate. Across decades, people had learned to comply or be ruined. Sarah took notes, mind racing between Harold's testimony and the diaries upstairs. The mathematics became clear. One boy, every so many years. One name repeated like a title, rather than a given name. She asked if anyone had tried to look deeper. "Plenty thought about it," Harold admitted. "But what's one man against a whole town willing to pretend it's not happening?" Sarah thanked him, though her stomach had sunk into ice. The sky was tipping toward full night as she walked, back up to the looming silhouette of the mansion. From the sidewalk, its windows reflected the crescent moon. Inside those walls, she knew were more secrets waiting, and the pull of the forbidden basement was already gnawing at her. The pull toward the basement began as a whisper in the back of Sarah's thoughts, but deepened into a need she couldn't shake. Each diary she'd read had drawn a boundary there. Do not enter the basement. Each boy had known about it, skirted it, feared it. That was enough to convince her that this was where the truth lived, the heart of whatever the Durnhams had been doing for nearly a century. Her initial sweep of the first floor had located the door, plain, narrow, at the end of a short hallway off the kitchen. Even now, as she stood facing it with her flashlight beam trembling over its surface, she felt the thickness of the quiet between her and whatever lay beyond. Locks, layers of them. A rusted padlock looped through a hasp. Above it, a modern deadbolt, and reinforcing the whole frame, a steel crossbar bolted into the wall. These had been added in stages, the wood scarred from each new fitting in the carriage house. Sarah's search for a crowbar stirred up the smell of oil and grass, clippings. It was leaning in a corner, heavy enough to make her arm ache as she carried it back inside. Every movement seemed amplified in the still air. The metallic scrape of steel on metal, the crack of wood as the crossbar released. She held her breath. When the final bolt gave under her hand, the smell hit her first, sharp, chemical, undercut with something organic that made her stomach knot. She switched on her flashlight and began the descent. The stairs were steep, boards groaning under her cautious steps dotted the bottom. The beams swept across the room, and her mouth went dry. The basement did not look like any domestic storage space. Walls had been retrofitted with stone, the mortar pale and new in places. Two massive tables of stone dominated the center, their surfaces carved with narrow, deliberate channels that led toward drains in the floor. The walls bristled with arrays of tools, blades, clamps, instruments whose uses Sarah didn't want to imagine. Some were rusted relics, others gleamed, as though they'd been cleaned and oiled not long ago. Pinned beside them were yellowed anatomical diagrams, all human, all annotated in a tight, neat hand. The focus was obsessive, sketches of the heart, the branching of arteries, the fine lace of nerve endings along the spine, and on the far wall, opposite where she stood, a platform of black stone, darker even than the rest, sat under a low arch. It was no ordinary construction. The channels carved into its surface hinted at the unthinkable. Fear told her to turn and leave. Instinct in years, chasing truths others avoided, drove her forward. Glass cases lined one corner, each holding a book. These were not like the boys' diaries upstairs. These were written in an adult's hand, the ink precise, the tone clinical. She stepped closer and read. The boy arrived today, Thomas. Number 5. Strong, healthy. Preparation year commences now. Ceremony to take place at dark moon. Anniversary of arrival, as always. The vitality must be fresh, the fear sustained. Sarah's vision narrowed. She flipped forward through pages that documented preparations across decades. Special diets. Daily doses of compounds to condition the body. Instructions for minimizing injuries in the lead-up, so that final extraction could proceed without premature collapse. The cruelty was laid out as plainly as any recipe. The rituals were spoken of as inheritance, duty, heritage, necessity. Notes tallied the apparent benefits: lack of illness, longer life, sustained vigor into advanced age. Her hands were trembling by the time she set the book back down, on a shelf beneath. Smaller boxes bore brass nameplates. Thomas, 1927. Thomas, 1943. Thomas, 1960. Sarah would not, could not, open them. Not yet. She backed away, the beam of her flashlight trembling now, not from weakness in her grip, but because she could sense the edges of what she'd just stepped into. The Durnhams hadn't hidden a shameful family incident. They had preserved an entire machine of cruelty in plain sight, greased by power and the silence of those who owed them or feared them. By the time she climbed the stairs again and shoved, the door closed. Her chest felt tight, her mind a careful, dangerous whirlwind. The house seemed to press closer around her, alert now, aware she had crossed its most sacred threshold. The question was no longer whether something terrible had happened here. It was how far the roots of it reached beyond these walls. Upstairs, the stale air of the parlor felt different now, denser somehow, as though the walls had absorbed the contents of the basement and were still whispering them back. Sarah dropped onto a dust-covered settee, rubbed the grit from her palms, and considered her next move. No matter how well documented her photographs and notes might be, she knew this couldn't be done alone. The basement's existence, the patterns she'd traced in portraits and diaries, all of it pointed to generations of complicity among people who could still be walking the streets of Millbrook. Any wrong step could tip them off. It was during another cautious foray into town that her second breakthrough came. At a coffee counter outside the square, far enough from the main street chatter to avoid suspicious ears, she found Jenny Williams. Or rather, Jenny found her. "You're staying in that house?" Jenny said without preamble, sliding into the seat across from Sarah. There was no mistaking the carved edge in her tone, not hostility, but urgency. Jenny was in her mid-20s, sharp-eyed, her dark hair swept back carelessly. When Sarah mentioned the name Thomas, Jenny stiffened. "My brother," she said. "Thomas Williams. Disappeared in 2012. They said runaway. He wasn't, and I've spent 8 years trying to prove it. As Jenny laid out her own slim but dogged archive newspaper clippings, faded flyers, transcripts of hostile police interviews, the outline aligned perfectly with Sarah's findings. The dates matched the last diary. The description of an abrupt disappearance, followed by local indifference, matched the rhythm of fear Sarah had gleaned from Harold Petton's words. Jenny's file wasn't just personal grief turned to paper. It contained scraps Sarah hadn't yet reached old family debt ledgers, naming households who'd once gifted sons to the Durnhams, public records showing property disputes that mysteriously resolved in the family's favor, and, chillingly, photographs Jenny had zoomed in on of Broderick Durnham, a figure from the 80s. Visiting then-current mayoral offices with envelopes in hand, they made an agreement before the cups on the table had cooled. Sarah had the keys to the physical evidence. Jenny had the story's human thread and tenacious will. That night, armed with cameras, gloves, and shared resolve, they combed the house together. Jenny's breath hitched at the portraits. She ran a fingertip over the faint outlines where faces had been sliced away. In the third-floor room, she knelt over the smallest set of clothes from the hidden alcove, exhaling shakily. "My mom made him those jeans," she said, voice barely more than a whisper, when Sarah showed her the basement. Jenny stood still a long time before stepping forward, unwavered by the stench that clung there. Her flashlight beam cut across the black altar, the locked cases. "This is where," Jenny said tightly, "this is where they brought him." They documented every surface, every page of the leather-bound ritual journals they could open. In one, the neat script read, "Thomas the 6th final night before the harvest. Condition excellent. No injuries beyond minor discipline. Fear present. Escalating." The pages that followed were far worse. Preparations for transfer. Diagrams of energy channels marked across a young boy's form. The coal deficiency in the notes left both women silent for a long stretch. The only sound there, shoes shifting over the basement's cold stone. Back upstairs. Sarah outlined her plan. They would need something irrefutable to take beyond Millbrook's borders. Local law enforcement was woven too tightly into the Durnham fabric. Jenny nodded, but added, "We can't just hand this off half done. They'll bury it before it sees daylight, or worse." Both women knew what that worse implied. These weren't crimes buried solely by anonymity. They were kept alive by active defenders who benefited from the silence. Outside agencies, federal, would have to be their first call, but only after they'd amassed enough that a full investigation couldn't be brushed aside. They would start with the property itself, the glaring absence of any burial records, and the perfectly preserved state of certain sections of the basement. Suggested there was more hidden here than the family's ledgers and tools. Somewhere under their feet, the missing could yet remain in a form that would be impossible to deny. Jenny had the contact, a construction crew acquaintance willing to quietly loan them a ground-penetrating radar unit for a renovation project. If something lay beneath that stonework, it would no longer stay hidden. The following afternoon, the October light was thin and sallow when Sarah heard the faint crunch of tires on the carriage drive. Jenny arrived in a dented pickup, the kind you could imagine hauling tools to a job site. Nothing remarkable enough to attract attention, except, perhaps, for what rattled quietly in the bed, a ground-penetrating radar unit sealed in a scuffed case. They waited until shadow had settled into the corners of the house before bringing it inside. Even though the mansion sat back from Elm Street, there was a constant, low-grade paranoia now. The feeling that any passing glance through the wrought iron fence might not be casual. Downstairs, the basement air pressed cold against their skin, carrying the same mingled metal and chemical temps that had first greeted Sarah. They set the unit on the mid-floor stone and uncoiled cables with slow deliberation. Each movement amplified by the hushed dot, Jenny maneuvered the scanner. along the perimeter first. The readings spiked over one wall, the farthest, nearly hidden behind shelving they'd pushed aside the night before. The texture behind it registered differently, denser than soil. Structured, but irregular. Sarah ran a hand along the mortar, noting the faint outline where bricks didn't quite match. Someone had tiled over a false partition. Probably decades ago. Crowbar in hand again, they pried at the seam until, with a muted crack, a loose brick came away, releasing a stale gust unmistakably tinged with rot. Jenny met Sarah's eyes. Neither spoke. The hole widened with each careful removal, until an opening gaped wide enough for the flashlight beam to pierce. Inside was a narrow, cold chamber, and within it, arrangements that froze their breath. There were 6, or what remained, of them. ODs positioned with deliberate care on low stone plinths, accompanied by clothing folded at their sides, small keepsakes laid neatly, as if for a viewing. The preservation of flesh in some cases was startling. Chemical treatment, perhaps, or the dry, sealed environment. Metal plaques were affixed at each's head. Each bore a date. Each bore a name. Thomas. The style of clothing, the age of the bones, or pale skin, the alignment of the dates, all of it knitted perfectly, with the diary's timelines. These were not hurried burials, they were trophies. Jenny moved closer, her hand visibly shaking, as it hovered over the smallest folded shirt. He wore this to his birthday, she whispered. It was one thing to read entries, another entirely to stand within arm's length of their proof. No words in a court filing could ever replicate the raw, deliberate cruelty of a century's careful keeping. They documented everything. Wide shots, close-ups. Sarah photographed the plaques, the condition of the remains, the juxtaposition of personal items, a ring, a book, a toy truck with chipped paint. Jenny noted serial numbers on chemical canisters stacked in a corner, still faintly smelling of formaldehyde. By the time they sealed up the chamber again, they knew the case file they were building could detonate far beyond Millbrook's borders. They also knew the danger. The number of people who would risk anything to bury this again, likely included some still watching them now. Jenny argued for immediate contact with the FBI. Sarah agreed, but with the stipulation that they do so from outside Millbrook, on neutral ground. Locals in positions of authority could not be trusted. Harold's years-old warnings, and Jenny's own history of being arrested on the Durnham's orders were proof enough. They chose the nearest regional field office 2 counties over. It meant one more night in the mansion. That night, neither slept much. Sarah lay in the 3rd-floor bedroom, the recessed alcove closed, but not locked. Her mind pacing backward through every step. The moment she took the house key from the lawyer's envelope, the smell in the grand foyer, Harold's brittle voice. Jenny, downstairs in the parlor, with the photo stick containing their evidence, flinched at every creak in the beams above her. The house may have been full of things long dead, but it felt awake. They left before dawn, the sky still that deep pre-sunrise blue that makes every shadow feel denser. Jenny drove, the photo stick of evidence in her jacket pocket, Sarah's laptop, and backup drives in a tote between them. Neither spoke much on the empty back roads out of Millbrook. The sense of crossing an invisible boundary, away from the Durnham's reach, was enough to keep them focused forward. By mid-morning, they stood in the reception of a regional FBI field office, identifying themselves to an agent in a dark suit who barely looked up from his clipboard until Sarah slid a folder of photographs across the counter. Within 30 minutes, they were in a closed interview room with 2 senior agents. Details unfolded methodically. The inheritance, the decaying house, the basement chamber, the hidden dead. As each image appeared on the conference monitor, the room's air seemed to contract. The agents didn't doubt them. The photographic evidence alone was too substantial. But the mention of repeated names, a 93-year gap of celebrated harvests, and signs of official protections from within Millbrook shifted the tone. It wasn't a single family's brutality. It was a managed operation. While Sarah spoke, Jenny sat rigid, fingers clamped around her coffee cup, when she described her brother's disappearance. Her voice wavered just once. The FBI acted faster than either had expected. By nightfall, a task force had quietly entered Millbrook, taking up positions, some overt, to freeze the house and property. Others less visible, gathering documents from the courthouse, the bank, the town hall. The arrests began within 2 days, first in widening concentric circles. A retired sheriff, 2 current deputies, a councilman, the former mayor, business owners, who'd bankrolled the Durnham's veneer of charity, every one of them tied, in some way, to the silencing of families who had lost a son. And with every interrogation came more names. That was how the circle widened beyond Millbrook. Margaret Durnham's personal files, retrieved from a locked cabinet in her upstairs study, contained decades of correspondence with other keeper families scattered across New England. Letterhead from Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts. All careful etiquette on its face, but in the right context. Phrases like preparation, complete, and dark moon arrival were no longer cryptic. Sarah hadn't expected Margaret's own hand to be the thing that pushed the investigation over state lines. But the realization was sobering. Her great-aunt hadn't just preserved these crimes, she'd cultivated alliances. Jenny stayed in constant contact as the Bureau unraveled one property after another, sealed off wings of old homes in rural towns, concealed basement chambers behind false walls, old cold cases tucked in local files as unfounded runaway reports. The count climbed quickly. Millbrook, once a place of unbroken silence, became the nexus of a scandal that filled national headlines. But within that deluge was an undeniable fact. 6 boys had been found beneath the Durnham's home, and their names, dates, and belongings spoke with more power than any denial. By the second week, over a dozen suspects were in federal custody for crimes ranging from conspiracy to homicide. Indictments were thick with charges of obstruction, falsification of records, and something far darker, the organized trafficking of children under the guise of guardianship. Encoded in polite society's language, Sarah and Jenny were briefly returned to Millbrook, under escort to walk federal teams through their steps in the house, watching agents comb through the rooms, lifting boards, dusting the frames of oil portraits, was both vindication and a strange form of grief. The Durnham mansion, stripped of its aura of untouchability, looked smaller, yet the residual weight in its halls was undeniable, as if the past simply lingered without its keepers. Jenny said it aloud before they left. "We're not done until this place is gone." By the 3rd week of the FBI's presence in Millbrook, the town no longer resembled the quiet enclave Sarah had first driven into. Parked black SUVs lined the curb outside government buildings. Agents carried boxes of records past front porches, where sheer curtains twitched just enough to show who was watching. Shops that had been open since the 1960s now kept their blinds drawn. Indictments tallied at 17. Arrests not only Durnham bloodlines but those who had protected them. Law enforcement officers, council members, long-standing business leaders. Some were older and frail, carried out in wheelchairs. Others were middle-aged, pale and tight-lipped, their professional facades collapsing under news cameras. Through seized letters, preserved journals, and a meticulous timeline drafted from Sarah and Jenny's combined documentation, prosecutors laid out a narrative in black and white. Millbrook's prosperity had been leveraged for silence, its debts leveraged for children's lives. Thomas after Thomas vanished on cue, always into one address on Elm Street, with permission from the victims' families. Federal teams escorted Sarah and Jenny one last time through the mansion, not to gather evidence this time, but to witness it stripped bare. Every portrait was removed, boxed, tagged. Every paneled wall that had hidden an alcove was dismantled. The black altar was pried from the basement's foundation and hoisted into a truck like a malignant relic. 2 weeks later, the Durnham mansion was reduced, brick by brick, under the cool gaze of autumn sunlight. There was no crowd, just the rumble of machinery and the quiet presence of the families watching from a distance. By month's end, the land had been cleared. In place of the shadow the house cast for more than a century, the first stones of the memorial garden were set. 6 headstones, each etched with a full name, now stood in a semicircle, where the great oak once bent toward the Roofline. Sarah ran a hand over the cool granite of the one marked Thomas Williams. Beside her, Jenny stood without speaking, the wind lifting her hair. For Millbrook, the destruction of the house was only the physical part of an exorcism. The moral reckoning could take decades. Some residents embraced the new chapter, volunteering to plant flowers and tend the memorial. Others kept their distance, the stain of complicity not easily scrubbed away. But the space was no longer empty. School groups began visiting their guides, speaking plainly about what had happened, not as gossip, but as a warning. And each year, on the date the FBI first breached the false wall, families and strangers alike placed fresh bouquets at the stones. Sarah returned often, sometimes alone, sometimes with Jenny. It was not comfort she sought there, but clarity. Every step through the garden reminded her of the night she cut open that wall, of the hush in the air before she'd pulled aside the first brick, and of the truth that even 93 years of darkness could not hold forever. Some walls hide wiring, others hide rot. The Durnham mansion hid 93 years of ritual and silence, and 6 boys the town was content to forget. If this story unsettled you, share it with someone who thinks history's darkest chapters are always in the past. Tap that like button to help us keep uncovering these buried truths. And subscribe to Unseen Anthology so you never miss what we bring into the light. Turn on notifications because the next place we go may look peaceful on the outside, but inside holds a truth as cold and patient as the Durnham cellar. Some secrets want to stay hidden. Together, we'll see they never can.